Okay, this is the second evolution video, and this is going to be sections 16.3 and 16.4, and this talks about Darwin presenting his information and the evolution the evidence for evolution. So, if you remember, it was about 20 years from the time that Darwin went on his voyage to when he published his information. Well, what happened was, in 1858, Darwin reviewed an essay containing similar ideas about evolution. There was a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, and he worked in Malaysia, and he presented his essay along with some of Darwin's observations at a meeting in 1858. So Darwin did not want to get scooped. In other words, he didn't want Wallace to beat him in publishing all the information. So Darwin decided to go ahead and move on with his work, and in 1859 he published his complete work on evolution, and the name of the book was called On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species. Okay? So, under what conditions does natural selection occur? So, Darwin said that natural selection will occur in any situation in which, number one, there has to be some type of competition. In other words, there has to be either a competition for food, competition for space, like we talked about in the last video, remember Malthus, also, there has to be variation in the population, and the variation has to be in the form of adaptations. So, and these adaptations have to be heritable. In other words, they have to be able to be passed on to the offspring. And then thirdly, there has to be variable fitness among the individuals. Remember, the survival of the fittest. So if individuals have to compete for this food or space, Darwin described this as the struggle for existence. The struggle for existence. Now, when we talk about variations, usually those are adaptations. And an adaptation would be any characteristic that an organism has that allows it to survive and reproduce in the environment. That's called an adaptation. This caribou that I have a picture of, first of all, it's got really thick, a very thick coat, and that protects him in the winter from the the blistering cold. In the summer, it protects him from the insect bites. I remember when we lived up in northern Michigan, near Canada, in the summer they have these huge horse flies, and that bite, and they really hurt when they bite you. This caribou also has hooves that have fur on them, and that helps it to grip in the habitat that it's in, which is usually where? Right, like the tundra, areas like that. Adaptations can be body parts, they can be structures, they can be camouflage, they can even be physiological functions. So the ability for a plant to carry out photosynthesis. And if you remember from the first term when we talked about photosynthesis, some plants carry out photosynthesis at night. They collect the carbon dioxide, and then they do it at night because it's so hot during the day in the environment that they're in. So those plants that are able to do that in a hot environment would have an advantage over those that couldn't. On the left, actually both of these are called scorpion fish, and they can adapt their coloring to blend in with the background. So the left, this is a scorpion fish, and then the one on the bottom in the middle there is a scorpion fish also. Now when we talk about survival of the fittest, we're talking about fitness. And what is fitness? It's how well an organism can survive and reproduce in the environment, in its environment. Survive and reproduce, that's what it's all about. So if an organism is not well suited for its environment, it'll either die without reproducing, or it's not going to have a lot of offspring. And this means that it has low fitness. Low fitness. If you remember, a lot of the genetic diseases we talked about that are possible, people that have those diseases usually are sterile. They're not able to have children. So, I mean, that kind of goes in with the natural selection part. So people that have certain diseases may not be as fit as those that don't. And so nature kind of selects against those. Okay? So when we talk about survival, we're talking about reproducing and passing on those adaptations that allowed them to survive. So Darwin named the way that evolution occurs natural selection, because it's very similar to artificial selection, except that nature is the one, or the environment is the one that does the selecting, not humans. An example of nature selecting, if you look at plants, plants have many different ways to pollinate, that they could be pollinated. Some are pollinated by wind, some are pollinated by insects, some are pollinated by humans, some are pollinated by animals, like animals eat the fruit, they drop the seeds, and they get pollinated that way. But the pollination works well enough for all of these different types of plants to survive and reproduce. Because if they all were pollinated the same way, then many of them would not survive and reproduce. So what happens to a species that does not have any variation in it, or that they don't have adaptations that allow them to change if the environment change, or that allow them to survive in a changed environment? That's right, they can become, they can become what we call extinct. So what does Darwin's mechanism suggest for living and extinct species? Well, first of all, living and extinct are discovered, or the evidence for that is the fossil record. And from that you could tell what animals have common ancestors. So here is a picture of the tree of life, and the common ancestor would be down at the bottom here. As far as for all of them, they all will be common here, and each branch would be a different organism, or different, actually you could have a whole bunch of branches for species, but this is kind of divided up into the kingdoms. So right here would be your bacteria. Okay, here would be your plants, and then here are your animals. Okay, here are going to be your protista or protists. Okay, and did I leave any out? Well, here are your red algae. These usually go with the protists also. Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Did I leave any out? We got fungi. My bad. Where's fun? Oh, here they are, right here. And then here are your fungi. Okay, and that gives you all the kingdoms. Now, as far as evidence for evolution, there's a couple. You have to understand that when Darwin published his book, and what was the name of it? That's right, On the Origin of Species. When he published this book, a lot of the discoveries in the other sciences had not happened yet. So we didn't have all this stuff in geology, geography, especially DNA, genetics, molecular biology. A lot of those, none of those things had happened yet. So over time, these discoveries came to light, and it seems, or what has happened is that a lot of them support Darwin's theory of evolution. So the first one area is going to be biogeography. And in biogeography, two things are important. First of all, closely related species are different in slightly different climates. Closely related species are different in slightly different climates. The second is that distantly related species can be similar if they're in similar environments. Okay? So read those two over. You might want to stop the video, read those two to yourself to make sure you understand what is being said here. So here's an example of two that are closely related, but they're different. They're two monkeys. One's in South America, one's in Africa. Okay? And then here are two that are distantly related, but they look similar, don't they? So we got the rhea and the emu. And even though these may not have a common ancestor, because they come from similar environments, they have developed similarly. So when we look at the Earth, this is the next part, geology. So we did biogeography. Now we're looking at geology. So this would be in the area of geology. We know that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. And the way we know this is through what is called radioactive dating. If you remember in Mr. Burnett's class or Mr. Miller, when you were in 8th grade, you may have talked about carbon dating, and you talked about isotopes. Well, carbon-12 is the most common isotope, and if you remember from term 1, carbon is in all living organisms. Well, for living things, they can tell how old they were by doing the carbon dating. Because what happens as the carbon deteriorates, it turns into radioactive carbon, which is carbon-14. And it takes approximately 5,700 years for half of the carbon to turn into the radioactive carbon. So if they're able to figure out by the mass and the size and how much of it has converted to radioactive, they're able to calculate how old something is. Now, carbon dating is only good for about 60, 70,000 years. So they do have to use other elements in things to determine how old they are. So I believe they can use potassium, maybe, is it radon or uranium? One of those they can use, I know, to determine how old things are. So I want you to take a look at this picture, and let's look at this. I'm going to move this. So over here on the left, this is kind of like the tree of life for whales. So over here on the right would be the whales today. So here's the whales, here's some dolphins. And then over here on the left, let's move this. Oops, excuse me. Let me stop inking. Over here on the left would be the ancestors to those dolphins. So here we start off with a ancestor that was on legs, and he lived on land and in water. He had pretty strong legs. Now when we get to this one here, his legs are a lot smaller, and scientists doubt that he could have been able to, his legs were too small to hold that large body up. Then as we get, excuse me, I'm sorry, let me erase this. Then as we get over here to the Basilosaurus one, I should make this back smaller again so you can see it. The Basilosaurus one, here he is right here. He, on the other hand, doesn't have any legs, but if you look at his structure or the skeleton of him, they have little tiny nubs, so they still have a pelvis and they have some little legs, but they have really been minimized because they have not been used. So if you remember some of the stuff that Lamarck says, that would kind of come into play. And then as we get to the modern day whales, they still have a pelvis bone, and they have little tiny nubs where their legs used to be. Same thing is true with fossils. They can connect the dots between dinosaurs and birds.